This is Writing It, the podcast about academics and writing. I'm Rachel Gordon. Here we aim to make the process of writing and publishing a bit more transparent and a bit less overwhelming. Through conversations with editors and academics at all stages, from full professors to graduate students, independent scholars, and postdocs, we share stories, lessons, and helpful habits from our writing lives. Today's episode is part one of a really interesting two-part conversation with the award-winning literary scholar and biographer Heather Clark. It was fascinating to hear Heather explain how she moved from more academic writing to an immensely popular and widely celebrated biography of Sylvia Plath. Enjoy. We're really excited to get to speak with Heather Clark today. Heather Clark is a biographer, literary critic, and novelist. Her recent awards include a Guggenheim Fellowship, the Truman Capote Award for Literary Criticism, a National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholars Fellowship, a New York Public Library Coleman Center Fellowship, and a Leon Levy Center for Biography Fellowship at CUNY. Most recently, she is the author of Red Comet, The Short Life and Blazing Art of Sylvia Plath, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, the National Book Critics Circle Award, and the LA Times Book Prize in Biography, and was one of the New York Times 10 Best Books of 2021 and has been translated into 5 languages. Heather holds a bachelor's degree in English literature from Harvard and a doctorate in English from Oxford, and was formerly professor of contemporary poetry at the University of Huddersfield in the UK. Heather, it's such a pleasure to get to speak with you. I'm a huge fan of Red Comet, and I have several friends who also, none of us are, quote, Sylvia Plath people, but so that just made it all the more amazing how well you bring readers into the story. When Red Comet was first published, I remember several reviewers making the point that we might not have realized we needed another biography of Plath, but you had proved we did. I wonder if you remember when you were doing the proposal, either when you were trying to find the agent or when you and an agent were maybe trying to get an editor or publisher, did you feel like this was an argument or a case you had to make for why, yes, it's time for another biography of Sylvia Plath?
Absolutely. I think Red Comet is the 11th biography of Plath. So I knew going into this that I would have to make a very strong case that we needed a new biography of Plath. And I used to teach courses on Plath when I was a professor at Marlborough College in Vermont, which sadly has since closed. But it always bothered me that there wasn't a kind of big, meaty biography of Plath that I could assign to my students. And because, I felt like Plath was better known almost for the manner in which she died than she was for her brilliant poetry and fiction. And that just seemed a terrible travesty to me. I just felt like she'd been shortchanged in previous biographies for different reasons, whether it was, due to permissions or this sort of tendency to pathologize her and put her mental illness and suicide front and center, sort of sensationalize all that. And I just felt like Plath had almost become this cliche of the doomed and hysterical woman writer. And I want to use scare quotes around that phrase. Um, so, and, Hermione Lee was somebody who really inspired me. And, I've talked about this before. And her Virginia Woolf biography was the gold standard for me. And I just sort of thought, that's the book I want to write about Sylvia Plath. Hermione Lee has this great quote that was my guiding was the guiding force behind this book, which is that, and I'm going to paraphrase her wrong here, but she says something like women writers whose lives have been marked by mental illness, abuse, suicide, are often treated biographically as case histories first and professional writers second. And I remember reading that and thinking, oh my God, that's what I want to do. I want to make Plath the professional writer first. So it was just this a big moment of inspiration for me. And that's sort of how I came to the proposal, with that idea in mind, just trying to reframe Plath and um, talk about the literary journey, not necessarily the psychological one. But of course, I didn't want to whitewash that either. Um, but yeah, I found an agent, wrote up a proposal, and he helped me fine tune that. I didn't quite have it right. He thought it was a bit too academic the first time, and I'd written two academic monographs previously, so I didn't have much experience doing this kind of trade writing. But yeah, he helped me, and then we ended up selling it to Deb Garrison at Knopf.
Great. Yeah, it is a very traditional cradle to grave kind of biography. And I'm wondering if you got any pushback from agent or editor about all of the kind of childhood, tween years, and even there's great information there about Sylvia Plath's ancestry. Was everyone always on board with that, or how did you convince them?
Well, I remember the first meeting I had with Deb. This was 2012 is when I signed the contract, early 2012. And I remember her saying, "We want a doorstopper." And I said, "I can do that." So she probably regrets saying that.
Hmm.
But I felt like I had carte blanche to just go crazy, right? And so I felt like this was all, in a way, uncharted territory, even though it was biography number 11, because I had the luxury of space, right? I had been given permission to write a long, in-depth, dare I say, scholarly or critical biography, and none of the biographies had delved into her childhood or teenage years in any kind of significant way. I mean, they were all sort of 200, 300 pages long. So that was a huge opportunity for me. She only lived to be 30. So every year of her life takes on a greater significance that it might not have, right? If she lived to be 95. And that was very exciting for me as a biographer to feel like I was writing about this part of an iconic writer's life really for the first time. I published an article on Plath's juvenilia in the Journal of Modern Literature, maybe like halfway through writing Red Comet or farther along. I didn't publish that much from the biography. I just didn't have the bandwidth to do both. I wanted to focus on the biography, but that was something I thought, okay, this needs more attention. So I wrote about her juvenilia, and you can see a lot of her later themes in the archaeology of that early writing. She wrote reams of poetry and fiction when she was a kid and a teenager, and this is her apprenticeship, right? So I felt like it was important, it was necessary, and also I wanted to establish the kind of those early Cold War contexts in the 1940s. So so yeah, I wrote much more about that period of her life that had never been covered, and my editor cut a lot about the dating. So Plath had a lot of boyfriends in her teenage years and college years. Well, I say boyfriends again with the scare quotes. She went on a lot of dates, as many women of her generation did. It was they dated all the time, and so that a lot of that got cut. But my editor let me keep, the most of the literary aspects of those earlier chapters. Um, and same with the genealogy, like that hadn't really been looked at. And I just thought, here, I have this opportunity to write a lot about Sylvia Plath, and I'm going to run with it. I'm going to do it, and I'm going to try to uncover everything. So I just felt like this mission after Deb told me I could write a doorstopper.
Yeah, what a great way to be received. I guess that gets at, another question is I'd heard in a one interview you gave that you mentioned, I think they did a contract that was maybe a 506 or 600 word biography, and then, when you finish it, it's I think over 1,000.
Yeah.
Um, over 1,000 pages. And
Yeah.
so I wondered, since many academics would like to write more, how you manage that. But it sounds like the press and the editor were already receptive to something big.
Yes. And I think partly because I had framed it that way in my proposal, I had said, look, there's no Hermione Lee biography of Sylvia Plath. I think I might have even said that in the proposal. And everyone knows what that means, right? Um, and so I kept making this case. We need a more serious, scholarly, sophisticated, critical, whatever word you want to use, but um, a meteor biography of her. And so they were already they had already signed on to that. And I think I was very anxious. I was very anxious that they would make me cut it in half. At one point, I just stopped looking at the word count. Yeah, it made me scared. I just, I couldn't imagine cutting it in half. And I was just very lucky. I mean, Deb said, as long as it's under 1,000 pages, including notes, and it reads well, we can do it. So we cut a lot from the original manuscript was probably about 1,600 pages long.
Hmm.
Um, I don't know how long that would be in book pages, but just regular double space Microsoft Word
Yeah.
font 12, it was about 1,600 pages.
Hmm.
She helped me get it down. And I don't even remember at this point what I got. I mean, I do remember cutting a lot of the dating and the boyfriends, but yeah, I mean, I was just very lucky. I think so much depends on your editor and your editor's support. And when I was shopping the book in 2012, I had meetings with editors in New York at like the big five publishers, um and I was kind of audition, I was interviewing them too. And some of them, I didn't like their approach. I remember, I think one of them said, we want to make Plath sexy. And I just thought, oh no, that's exactly what I don't want to do. And when I met Deb, she totally got it. So it was this sort of meeting of the minds and serendipitous. So I think a lot of luck was involved, frankly.
Hmm. Yeah. Most of us are not taught about how to write biography in grad school. And I'm wondering, and sometimes it's even a little discouraged or sometimes looked down upon among academics. How did you figure out how to do it?
Well, I've always been interested in telling stories through my scholarship. I was never as interested in literary theory, which of course was huge in the 90s when I was an undergraduate at Harvard. And a lot of literary theory just left me cold. I felt like it wasn't what I'd signed up for when I chose to major in English, and that there'd almost been this bait and switch. So I took a lot of fiction writing classes as an undergrad and thought maybe I'll do an MFA. But I'm a first generation college student and I had a lot of student debt when I graduated. And I just I just thought I can't, what am I going to do with an MFA? How am I going to pay the bills? So so then I thought, oh, I'll get a PhD and I'll become a professor and I'll read and write and get paid to teach and it'll be so great, totally naive about the job market. We all know there are no jobs. Um, but I was optimistic and, as I say, quite naive. So I decided to get a PhD instead, and I went to Oxford because I had heard, I don't even remember who told me this, but I heard that you could write a dissertation there that didn't involve literary theory. I was like a theory refugee.
Hmm.
I just thought, oh my God, if I stay at Harvard, I'll be miserable. And I got lucky. My PhD supervisor was a biographer. So his name was John Stallworthy, and he had written wonderful biographies of Louis MacNeice and Wilfred Owen. He was also a poet and a scholar. And so you know, I wanted to write not a biography, a dissertation on that studied poetry in Northern Ireland in the 1960s and kind of the way that those poets like Seamus Heaney and Paul Muldoon, Michael Longley and Derek Mahon had responded to the Troubles. And he said, "Yeah, this is great. But you have to go to a lot of archives and you should write to them all and you should write them letters. You should try to interview them." And I thought, "What? Archives? Interviews?" Well, this man is speaking my language. Like, That just hadn't been something I'd ever been taught to do as an undergrad. And so again, I feel like there was a lot of respect for biography at Oxford. The Oxford Center for Life Writing was there at Wolfson College. I would see Hermione Lee just kind of walking around
Wow.
Wolfson because my supervisor was
Hmm.
at Wolfson College as well. So
Yeah.
when I had lunch with him, I met her,
Wow.
many.
Hmm.
And so it was so inspiring just to be in that atmosphere. And now I see that my first book, it was a group biography. And I'm kind of it's so obvious to me now that it was a group biography of these poets who were coming of age in Belfast in the 1960s and how they reacted to the Civil War. I don't think I ever would have been allowed to write a book like that at an American university. Um, so, but biography wasn't necessarily a dirty word over there. Um, so and I don't know that anyone ever kind of taught me, but the way that my supervisor steered me towards biographical research, and kind of gave me permission, I think, to run with that, um, that mattered. That mattered to me. And then I kind of, um, yeah, I tried to tell stories, I guess.
One of the many reasons I found it such a readable biography is the way you wove in social and cultural history, really giving the reader this great feeling for the time and place in which Plath was living. Um, I mean, I guess I do wonder, how did you know what was the right amount and when to kind of drop back into that context and then come back to her?
Yeah, that was hard. Just trying to balance the life and the work and the world.
Hmm.
Just balancing those three things. I'm very interested in history. I think I'm probably a frustrated historian. I've always tried to take a literary slash historical slash biographical approach, in most of my scholarship. And I think biography is history. And I saw Plath very much as a woman of both of her time and ahead of her time. So I wanted to make that case. And to do so, I had to give the reader a sense of the times, a sense of the world that she grew up in. I had this large canvas, and I think biography kind of gives you that as it gives you that canvas to kind of create this whole world. So what I what I wanted to convey the most was the sexism really of the 1950s in America, the unrelenting sexism. I mean, this was the sea she swam in. In my prologue to Red Comet, or my introduction, I can't remember. I quote Adlai Stevenson's Smith College commencement speech in 1955, in which he told them that they were all going to become, quote, humble housewives, unquote. And he went on, and it's just unbelievable. If you read this speech today, and he was a liberal, like he was a Democrat, and everyone clapped at the end, and no one protested. So that to me was sort of this perfect example of how bad it was. These are some of the most brilliant women in America, and their commencement speaker is telling them they're all going to go off and become humble housewives. So that sort of thing, just giving readers, examples like that kind of context, and also creating a sense of Cold War anxiety, I suppose, trying to describe all of that and what it was like to live, then. And that's something I'm doing even more in my current book, which is, a group biography, about the Boston years of Sylvia Plath, Anne Sexton, Adrienne Rich, and Maxine Kumin, because they all lived in Boston in the late 50s and knew each other. And that's much more, like, the Cold War plays a much bigger role in that book. So, so it's just something, trying to bring this history alive. I suppose it's a cliche, but it's always been important to me. And that's partly why I love writing biography, because you get to write history.
True. Yeah. One of the things I was thinking as I read it is because Plath, wrote The Bell Jar, which was a work of fiction that seems so close to her life, you had to deal with that, I guess, when you could say it was true to Plath's experience and when you needed to let us know it wasn't. How did you, what was your thinking on how to handle that in the biography?
Yeah, that was one of the more difficult parts. Like where should I talk about the bell jar? Do I talk about it in 1953 because it's about what happened to her in 1953, or do I talk about it in 1961 when she wrote it? And I think a lot of the difficulty in biography for me is just figuring out where to put stuff. I'm always moving things around and experimenting with where they sound best or make the most sense. And I think when you're talking about confessional writers, quote unquote confessional writers, yeah, there's a tendency to read the work biographically. And I tried very hard not to indulge that too much. I thought, I just wanted to give Plath the dignity of irony, right? I think in the Bell Jar, Plath is sort of looking back on a younger, maybe version of herself, but there's a lot of irony in that book and a lot of political commentary between the lines. I think it's an incredibly political novel, and it's hardly ever taught that way. It's a Cold War novel. It's she's protesting mental health conditions. She's protesting the Eisenhower era's repression of women. I mean, there's just so much going on in that novel that's political and doesn't necessarily have to do with the breakdown and suicide of a college girl. And that's how it was, of course, marketed when it came out. So I just tried to really treat it as a novel and not a roman à clef or a memoir. And because Plath was inspired by people like Joyce, Portrait of the Artist. I think she's sort of rewriting Portrait of the Artist. So I tried to always bring it back to the art and the craft, and that's the more interesting way to talk about it, right? It's not that interesting if you're just saying, oh, the bell jar is it's just like a reflection of her life, and no. And even in her confessional poetry, she's treating that idea of confessionalism again with great irony so often. And I think if we read the poems as mere autobiography or mere reflections of the life, we just miss that. We miss that irony. So I was always very, or I tried to be self-aware about that and falling into that trap, and always treating her as an artist and a writer, um, and not just, she wasn't just a diarist, right?
Right. I mean, I
Yeah.
actually sometimes bring in the beginning of the bell jar, even in teaching American Jewish history or post war American Jews. The fact that she opens with the Rosenbergs is very striking because it's hard for us to even find any American Jewish writers who will come out because it's such a fraught topic for them. I mean, it's something that sort of unifies American Jews is that they're all sort of cringing in this moment to have Jews, a spotlight on Jews in this
Mhm.
very negative way. But it's sometimes from these other non-Jewish intellectuals and writers that they can go there, um,
Right.
and
Right.
it is so interesting to know that it was on their mind as it seems it might have been for Plath too, not just her character.
Yeah. Yeah, she was horrified by the execution of the Rosenbergs. She wrote about it in her diary. Um, and she comes down very hard in the bell jar, actually, on some of the women who supported it. And I think she saw in it a brilliant metaphor for what Esther goes through. I mean, the Rosenbergs, the very, very first sentence of the novel, they're electrocuted, right, for dissidence. And what happens to Esther? She has to endure electric shock, right, for her own kind of dissidence. And it's just a brilliant parallel that Plath sets up in the first sentence of that novel. Um, and I just have so much admiration for what she's doing with the politics.
Yeah.
making the political personal way before
Right.
way before second wave feminism, that's why this novel is, it's a proto-feminist novel.
Yeah.
uh,
You hinted at this before, but in the organizing the material for this biography, were you using files by decade? I mean, I thought that was a really interesting issue you brought up about where to place writing. Whether it's in the era when it's at least
mhm.
partly mirrors some of what's going on in her life, or when it's published and being read by others. So, how did you go about organizing things?
So I organize my files by archive, which might sound a little strange, but I I went to so many different archives, and basically what I do when I go to an archive is just sit there for a week and take pictures. I, I barely stop to read anything. And however long it takes me to reproduce the archive, I bring it home. And then later, obviously, I go through it. But yeah, so I write chronologically, and I just have to, because otherwise I'll get overwhelmed with the amount of the material. So I don't skip around really. I don't write the end and then go back to the middle and then end again, beginning. No, 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 no. But it allows me to then I'll just go through the archives, and I always just reproduce their organizing system. So whatever they do, if they list the correspondence alphabetically, that's how I file it. If it's by year, I always like when it's by year. That's much easier. So I'll just kind of go through whatever month of whatever year it is, in all of those archives that are now on my computer, and
Mm.
just put things together. And of course, you've got the interviews and all of that. So that's kind of how I organize.
It makes sense. And this might sound like a boring question, but since most of our readers, or I should say listeners, are academics and writers, it's always interesting to hear how other people go about it. Thanks for listening to Writing It, the podcast about academics and writing, sponsored by the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Florida. Visit our podcast description to find out how to contact us and send us your questions about academic writing and publishing. Follow us on social media at Writing It Pod, and subscribe to us so you never miss an episode.